Welcome back to the Flow Performance Podcast. My name is Ricky Dan, founder of Flow Nutrition and your host. On today's episode, we chat with biomechanist Dr. James Forsyth. James is a lecturer, an academic program director, and biomechanist at the University of Wollongong. He is one of the very few people in the world who has completed a PhD in biomechanics in surfing, where he investigated the performance of aerial maneuvres. He is also an accredited strength and conditioning coach who has supported athletes at state, national, and international levels. I've looked up to James as a role model in academia for quite a few years now. His research, particularly in his PhD, was conducted at an incredibly high standard, and my own personal PhD research has been heavily influenced by the work that he's already done. Aside from his research, James is also a passionate surfer who also happens to absolutely rip. And lastly, a super exciting announcement. We have officially launched our new range of Flow nutritional bars. If you're enjoying the podcast and want to support the brand, make sure you jump on the website and grab some bars today. Our Flow Energy Bar is the easiest and most effective way to fuel before and during exercise, while our Recovery Bar nails the basics for post-exercise recovery. Just for listening to this podcast, you can get 10% off your total order with the code FLOWPOD at checkout. Now, this is such a cool chat, so let's dive straight into it. What's the go with the future of surfing research with Dr. James Forsyth?
3, 2, 1,
Alrighty, welcome back to the Flow Performance Podcast. My name is Ricky Dan, founder of Flow Nutrition. I'm down in Wollongong at Sharky Beach with the one and only Dr. James Forsyth. Mate, how are we doing?
Beautiful, sunny, warm, can't get much better.
It was a lovely drive down from Sydney this morning, and yeah, at Sharky Beach, terrible name of a beach, but nice little bank out there. Hopefully we can catch a wave soon, but no, beautiful day down here. So today's training-related question is, what's the go with the future of surfing research? And, you know, our backgrounds are in sports science, so probably in particular sports science, surfing research. So as the listeners would have just heard, you're one of the very few people in the world who has completed a PhD in surfing, essentially. So really interested to get your thoughts here, particularly because you're also still very active in the research space. So probably the first question is going to be, where are we currently sitting with surfing research, especially when you compare it with other sort of traditional sports? What are your sort of thoughts there?
It's definitely still in its infancy. So I guess if you compare it to some of your more traditional sports like swimming or football, there is much less out there for just your everyday person or a researcher even to use for some evidence. That said, there is some small pockets of researchers, practitioners around the world that's starting to really build it up, particularly with the focus on trying to improve Olympians and trying to win gold medals now. But there is definitely a building evidence base, which is helpful. Yeah.
Well, we really saw that era of, as we were chatting about before, Jeremy Shepherd's day at the HPC, where we had Ollie and Josh, those guys sort of building that foundation in a way for surfing research. And so I sort of feel like we have a decent understanding of like the physical characteristics, the physiological sort of profiles. So do you think we have like a good sort of base to start branching out into more sort of specific areas?
Definitely, and I think you're starting to see that too. I think a lot of the research now is trying to bridge that gap between not just how do we move around in the space, but also how do we improve performance of specific skills, and also how do we interact with our equipment, because that's the other big thing. Equipment is half of the sport. You've got the surfboard, you've got the fins, and we don't really have a good way of quantifying and understanding how we interact with those bits of equipment.
That's actually a really good point. It's something that I never really think of, because I think my mind's just so focused on the human body. I just always assume what other physiological characteristic can we look into, or but yeah. So then, in regards to equipment, what would you sort of suggest? Has there any? Actually, haven't looked into too much equipment research. Is there much done in surfing? I know you did a little bit on the fin stuff.
Yeah, there is not a lot, mostly because it's really expensive, right? Surfboards in general, fins in general, it's an expensive hobby for most. For research, when you want to control things, it becomes even more expensive. So yeah, you're right. I've been involved in a project that looked into 3D printing fins and changing the structural characteristics to see, and the design characteristics to see if it had an effect on surfing performance. Very difficult to quantify. Again, like when you think about surfing performance, it's not just how you ride a wave, it's how the wave works with the board, how you work with the board on the wave, and the conditions being so variable as they are, that obviously makes things really challenging to quantify.
So how do you control that? Because I know we've spent some time together down at Urban Surf as part of my research.
Yeah.
What did you do for your fin stuff? Did you do it at a wave pool? Did you head somewhere?
So we headed over to Indonesia. So we were very fortunate. We got a decent grant from the University of Wollongong, a couple of iterations of that, to take 6 surfers over to Macaroni's resort.
Tough life, mate. Sounds brutal.
Spend a week there. We got relatively lucky with the swell. We had consistent waves for a week. We got all 6 surfers in the water at least 5 times on 4 different fins. So we had obviously our commercial fin. We had a 3D printed version of the commercial fin, and then 2 versions where we modified the structural and functional characteristics to see if it had an effect. And then, like, because of the state of the sport and realistically what we can capture, we basically only had some perceptual differences. So we recorded using like a visual analog scale what each surfer perceived the fin characteristics to be like. So using some of the terminology that the industry uses, like power, hold, turnability, that sort of things, to characterize the performance of the fins. And then also tried to match that up with GPS and accelerometer data. So there was a company that unfortunately doesn't exist in the sport anymore called Trace. They had a device that you could place on any action sport board. So they had a good presence in surfing and a pretty decent presence in snowboarding as well. And essentially used GPS with the IMU, or inertial measurement unit, to understand and quantify surfing performance. So that actually spat out through a black box, so it's hard to know really, but you can reasonably say that it was along the right lines of recognizing turns, because it was more of a underestimate as opposed to an overestimate, but you could capture turn count, turn magnitude, speeds, all that sort of stuff, which was able to give us a bit more insight into the performance of the fins. Yeah,
that is so cool. I guess my mind goes straight to, like, how did you actually determine performance in a way? Because when you think of fins, it can be pretty subjective because it is based off a lot of feel. So you mentioned that you got their sort of perceptions on what it felt like, but how else can we record force in the water? Like, you can't just chuck a force plate in a surfboard. So do these, when you say accelerometers, do they sort of allow you to sort of measure those things as well? Or?
Yeah, well, I mean, not force. So realistically, we are not measuring the surfer on the board. We are just measuring the board, right? The sensor goes on the board, and it tracks the movement of the board on the wave. And that just literally gives you counts for turns, size or magnitude, like how big was the turn. You can't even get what type of turn, so you're not differentiating between like a cutback and a Rio. It's just, did you do a cutback or a bottom turn? That was how it classified it. But you can get some indication of the speed through that turn. So then you can sort to tease out things like, does the fin affect the flow on the wave, right? Are they able to carry speed through their turns? Do they lose speed through their turns? Again, it's very challenging to bring such a creative sport down to very simple metrics. But again, that's just kind of what you have to do with research too. You have to try and control as many things to tease out these relationships. What we did do was we ended up trying to see if there was a relationship between what the surfers perceived the fins to do versus what they actually did in the water. So we removed...
What did you find? Is this published yet?
No,
Is
it's not. It's not published yet. It's
yeah,
currently under review. So hopefully soon. But in essence, we added to some of my experience with the sport and what is starting to build up in the literature that it is very hard to quantify and understand things in such a variable context. But with some fancy statistics, there is definitely a bit of a relationship between what we perceive and what we do. Obviously, the strongest, perception that came across is, it feels like we're going faster, right? This fin felt like I was going faster. And if we're honest, what does a surfer want a lot of the time? They want to go fast. Yeah. Whether that's to be able to do a better turn or just because of that feeling of going fast. So
I'm guessing in this whole research process, they were blinded, so they didn't know what they were surfing, because that would have a big effect, right? If you were to tell someone, oh, we've got these brand new fins, they're going to make you 20% faster, that's probably going to have a pretty big psychological effect. So they had no idea what they were riding.
They had no idea. They had no idea what they were riding. We painted all of the fins black, and none of the surfers changed their fins. So we had a team. 2 researchers were on the boat, like in the channel. They'd have 20 to 30 minutes to go out and catch a couple of waves, try and do up to 10 turns, so we get a bit of data. Come back into the boat, hand the board back up, someone changes the fins, you pop in the boat, mark what you did on the subjective scales, and then you're back in the water. The board's already in the water for you waiting. So we did our best to control for that, because obviously that's a big deal. We also didn't have any information at that point in front of the surfers in terms of what we thought was going to be better, but we'd obviously done some predictions based on the shape. So there's computational fluid dynamics, or CFD. I think that's right.
And what's that in layman's terms?
Basically, building a model in a computer and simulating the effect of flow across the fins. And we found out that one particular fin, it was actually 2, and we tried to figure out if it would be different between our 2 experimental fin conditions. But they essentially suggested, based on this modelling, that there would be a 10% benefit. So 10% reduction in the drag forces, so an improvement in the lift-to-drag ratio. So in simple terms, like, does the fin moving through water move faster or slower?
Yeah.
Yeah.
That is so cool. How cool is research, eh?
Yeah.
That's bloody epic. So your PhD was specifically in biomechanics, and so obviously there's so many things we could touch on in the equipment side of surfing research. But going back to the human bodies, something that we can change fairly easily as well through training. What are your sort of thoughts on whether it's strength and conditioning, human biomechanics, physiology? Is there any direction you think we should sort of focus on or go in that sort of regard? For surfers?
I definitely think there is more to be gained from some simple research in that area. My research for my PhD was certainly focused a lot around landing performance and trying to understand how the body works to dissipate the forces of landing in an aerial, for example. There's still scope to understand that in more detail, and also thinking about the differences that may be present between males and females. Like, a lot of the literature at the moment is understandably, and this is not exclusive to surfing or action sports, but it is predominantly male focused, with a lot of the belief that the female body is too complex to be worth spending the time investigating, which is absolutely incorrect. I think there is a lot that we're missing out on in that space, especially from like a training perspective. Like, if we understand in more detail how a female responds based on their unique physiology, then we have a lot more to be gained from their training interventions.
Well, we're seeing more of that now at the HPC. We have the two girls there working in women's surfing, so hopefully it's becoming a bit more prevalent now. But yeah, definitely an area that needs just across the board in sports science, right? It's a little concerning how limiting the women's research is.
And if you dig into the physiological differences, you start to understand that it is not likely that they're going to have the same response. Like differences in muscle fiber contribution, the effect of that on muscle contraction and the ability to sustain muscle contraction. Does that mean that we're programming intensities or even training efforts for the right physiological outcome?
Yeah. No, there is so much we can look at, but there's quite a lot that we have done, and a big interest of mine is how we communicate these research findings to the surfing community, because it's one thing to do all this amazing research, and I've found this reflecting over my sort of PhD journey, where you can spend 3 years writing a research paper that your mum might read, yet
I think the average number of reads per scientific paper is somewhere, but you can count it on your two hands.
Yeah. See, that makes me sick. Like the amount of effort and the expertise that these authors have of these papers, and the messages just aren't getting out there. And what really blew my mind was I wrote an article for Surfing Life magazine a couple of years ago, just on basic recovery protocols for surfing. And I wrote that article in about 4 hours, I reckon, and had a couple of references in there, and I looked at their metrics on like how many surfers read this, and it was in the hundreds of thousands. So I was just sitting there going, man, you can spend 3 years creating this amazing research article that maybe a handful of people will read, yet alone you spend 4 hours publishing something in Surfing Life, and you're going to have more of an impact. So long-winded way of sort of asking, like, how can we disseminate these findings better as sort of researchers in surfing?
Yeah, it is a problem, and I'm no better for it, to be honest. Like I've done a few little interviews here and there, but that's not really it's not really using my background to promote what I understand and provide that information in a simple to interpret and easy to consume way. I think some of the publications that work in these sports have an opportunity. So like Stab Mag's a great example for me. Like they are actually starting to try and integrate some of the research into their publications. They have a very big platform. They have a subscription-based model which allows them to do that sort of thing.
Well, also, just to shout out to Stab, they supported Mackenzie Baker, one of my mates, published one of the first ever surfing nutrition papers. And so he just hit them up and said, look, I'm trying to find participants. Can you offer some sort of free trial of Stab Premium? And they gave him like an unlimited amount of premiums for participants. So yeah, thank you to those guys for just supporting research to start with, but definitely good avenues you can go down.
Yeah, and yeah. I think the whole academic world needs to change too. The way we consume information is very different. Some people are doing a good job of this. Like there's some researchers that are well beyond my age and experience that are delving into things like TikTok and Instagram to try and communicate in that way. I think the model of you got to go to a conference, you got to share your findings there is starting to kind of outdated, and the universities are rewarding it too. They're acknowledging that there are different ways to impact, but unfortunately, because the university model is still fixed in its space, it doesn't reward people, and I think that stifles creativity and the ability to get some of that stuff out there.
Well, they reward impact factors on journals. That's where the money is, and that's what they're pushing, is going for higher journals. It's not necessarily the impact on the surfing community or how much is this actually affecting the way competitive surfers train. It's just how many times the researchers citing it.
Yeah. One of the ways that I think in Australia we're trying to do is we have like a new agreement now which allows a lot more people to publish in open access. So pretty much, I can't say for certain, but like for the next few years there will be a lot more research that comes out that's free for everyone, which is a step, but it's not the step, because and for your everyday person to sit there and have a look at a research article, they're not really in the best position to interpret the findings. And some papers, say this one that we've got under review about the fins, not simple to interpret. Like, you've got some relatively complex statistics, which really makes it challenging for people to understand. So we need to do a better job as an academic, or as even people in the field practicing in and around these sports, using that sort of skill and knowledge that they've developed through their education, where it's being critical of what we see and being able to interpret, to an extent, scientific literature. We need to do a better job there too. Which you're doing with your podcast.
Well, mate, I was just going to say, that's exactly what I'm trying to aim for here. And even with the whole brand, is trying to explain complex things in simple ways for people, because the concept of even publishing a research paper and thinking that that is communicating your messages is just wrong. Because, like, I'm a full-time PhD student and I still struggle to interpret research. So how could we ever expect someone that hasn't done any research, isn't exposed to anything in the research world, has maybe read a couple of research articles, how do we expect them to understand the findings and interpret them properly? It should be on us in a way. Well, maybe not every researcher, but I think more researchers need to think of outside of the academic world, and how can we get this message across without the old Chinese whispers where it ends up on Channel 7 and they go, bloody, this one little thing in our water is going to kill us, because one study showed this one thing. Like, I feel like that's what's dangerous about it, particularly in the nutrition world, because so much of that information is just blown out of proportion. But I feel like we have an opportunity to really communicate these messages clearly, because we're the ones conducting the research. We know the limitations of our own research, and that's just as important to communicate. It's like, yeah, we found this, but that was just in 20 surfers we went over to Indo with and did this study. So, yeah.
6, not 20. This is 6.
Yeah, 20. Yeah.
Can't afford to fly 20 surfers to Indo, trust me.
I couldn't afford to fly one to Urban Surf for a few months. But no, mate, it's an area I'm so passionate about, and it's something that I'm trying to do more with the brand and the potty. So
I think it's a bit of a fluid space at the moment too, because I mean, with all of the advancements in artificial intelligence, machine learning, that's like now very accessible to everyone. I think we're going to start to see almost more of a role of those that have that background and that education to be able to not just communicate it, but ensure that we're communicating the right things. Because I don't know if you've got a lot of experience with like those large language models or anything like that, but if you only base your opinions on some of the things that they tell you, you might be a bit worried about what information you're actually getting, because yes, they're great for sourcing information and trying to understand a problem if you tell it the right information. And at the moment, we've probably got a bit more of a responsibility to make sure that fact checking is happening too, and trying to help everyone around us understand just how impactful is this literature. As you said, this is a small sample, or this was the specific conditions where this worked, or how generalizable are we talking, how specific, like trying to filter that through our trained lenses is probably very valuable at this time.
But I think what's not working in our favour is that our findings typically aren't that sexy. If you're going to stop scrolling on social media, you need to say something pretty freaking polarizing, and research just isn't that polarizing. It always starts with, it depends, or in this case.
I think the other thing too is that in surfing in particular, we're just not in a place where we can say with confidence, because there's not the evidence base. We have a select number of studies. None of them, I would say, have used similar methodologies. So you're grasping to try and say that this happened in a couple of different situations, so this should happen. There's just not the evidence there. I think that we'll get there soon. I think that there is a lot of like really interesting pockets of research around the world that are going to help build on that, but it just takes time, which leaves us in the lurch, and surfing is not really advancing that fast at the moment. So I think yeah, I don't know. Maybe we're not going to be able to help improve the sport as quickly as we think we can with that evidence as well.
That's the thing. Research just takes bloody time. That's one of the biggest limitations to it. But, mate, if there's someone out there that's just, let's say they're third or fourth year uni, they're just a frothing surfer, they love sports science, what would your advice be on a direction that they should sort of pursue? Or should they get in touch with you? Do you have any opportunities down here in beautiful Wollongong? Come down here. This is fantastic.
Yeah, I think...
What should they do?
Well, research is one of those things where you just realistically, you need to find something that you're passionate about. Like, you're not going to last long in research if you're not passionate about what you do. Focusing on the outcome is probably less beneficial for you long term. And then it's trying to find people that share that sort of that mission or that interest. Maybe I'm not the person down in Wollongong. Maybe I am. Maybe there's someone like at your university that you don't know about just because you haven't maybe had a look or asked some questions. I think one of the things that, as I've started to learn as a new academic, is students just don't know what's there. They don't know what's in front of them. And if you just ask a couple of questions, whether you're asking the right person or not, you'll find an answer pretty quickly, because if the person you're talking to doesn't know, they can definitely direct you down the line or down the hallway or into a different building that will help you get along that direction.
Yeah, absolutely. I was very lucky. I stumbled across the work of the HPC in my first year of uni, I think, and I had cutouts of the HPC Centre up on my little vision board being like, oh, I want to be Jeremy Shepherd and Oliver Farley.
I didn't even, for me, it was completely different. Like, I had no intention to go into research.
Yeah, wow.
Like, none at all.
Yeah.
I was fixed, and I had been since I was in school. I was like, I'm going to go to uni, I'm going to be a physio. I might work with surfers. That was still, that was always been present. I've always wanted to work in and around that sport, but I never thought I would do research. And I signed up to a small research subject in my undergrad. And at the end of the subject, one of my supervisors at the time, she was like, what do you really want to do? And I was like, oh, that's a big question. Maybe I'd be interested in doing something with knees. I tore my MCL when I was surfing when I was younger. I was like, oh, that's an interest. That's something I've got experience in. Maybe I could contribute to that. And then I said, oh, all surfing. And she was like, oh, we should have a conversation about that. And turns out she'd been working on a chapter with Jeremy. Julie Steele has been a big mentor of mine. And obviously she has her own experience in biomechanics research as one of the pioneers in ACL and landing research, but because at the time, specifically at that time, she was working on a chapter with Jeremy for a textbook, and she was like, maybe this is something that we can do. You've ticked the two things that you're interested in one question.
Yeah.
And then it just blossomed. It just went like, all right, well, I'll do an honours project.
Yeah.
My honours project was essentially a pilot study where I had more participants than my PhD final study, but I did more with my PhD.
Love it.
So yeah, it was just a springboard, and I think because of those two in particular, I've had a lot of really exciting opportunities in my young research career. Like, going to Indonesia was certainly because I'd met Julie, and Julie was working with someone else that was doing this engineering sort of focused surfing research, and now here I am.
That's amazing.
So don't
inspiring.
Yeah, don't discount just simple conversations or just saying what you're interested in to academics, because generally speaking, like, some academics will have their own agenda, but like a lot of the time people just want to see people enjoying what they do.
Yeah.
That's life, right? You just want to enjoy what you're doing.
Well, now that you say that, I actually remember in my first year of uni, I was a little nervous to sort of say I was into surfing, because when you're at uni in your exercise science degree, it's just sport, right? Everyone there is just fresh out of school.
I'm going to go work in sport as a physio.
Absolutely. And surfing, it wasn't really, it's still kind of a bit but it definitely wasn't seen as a sport back then. So even when you do group projects where you have to pick a sport, I was always internally like, oh, I would love to do this on surfing, but I just never ever spoke to anyone about it until, the day I saw the HPC stuff. And I was like, you know what, maybe there is something that you can pursue down this route. And once again, it just took like randomly emailing those guys. I caught up with, I think it was Josh first, or maybe Ollie, and then just met these guys and fell in love with what they're doing. And so my advice as well would be get out there and speak to these people, express your interests, and you'd be surprised at where you can go with it.
Absolutely.
Yeah. Oh, mate, what a freaking episode. I knew this was going to go for a long time because it's something that I just am so passionate about. And, mate, your insights there were awesome. So thank you so much for that.
No worries.
If someone does want to reach out, how can they get in touch? Via email or socials? Or
email, Twitter, or X, whatever you call it now. My Twitter is just James Forsyth 0. My email is jforsyth@uow.edu.au, but you can probably put that in whatever notes you've got, how you publish it out. Shoot me an email, shoot me a message on Twitter, X, whatever you want to call it. Always happy to chat, and if I can't help you, I'm sure I can find someone that's helpful for you to talk to.
And I reckon he'll be able to help you. He's a pretty knowledgeable bloke. And check out some of his research papers. You've done some amazing work, especially during your PhD there. So I certainly look up to a lot of the work you've done. And really appreciate this chat, mate. And listeners, thank you so much for tuning in. We will catch you again next week to answer more of your questions. Thanks, mate.
Thanks.
Thanks for listening to another episode of the Flow Performance Podcast. I hope you enjoyed the chat and found loads of value that you can use to fuel your flow state. If you did enjoy the content and want to support the brand, make sure you jump on the website and grab some Flow nutritional bars. They are the most effective and convenient way to fuel your flow state. And as a valued podcast listener, you can get 10% off your total order with the code FLOWPOD at checkout. So thanks again for tuning in. We will catch you again next week.